back. Remember UGA interview with Dr. Nash Boney, conducted by Fran on July 10, 2008 at the University of Georgia Visitor Center. Dr. Boney is a historian and author of a pictorial history of the University of Georgia. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Boney.
Glad to be here.
This is a special going back interview session because not only were you a longtime faculty member, but you also have done extensive research on history of the university. And you're going to aid us in better understanding those long ago events that shaped us and in clarifying many of the recollections referenced by those whom have been previously interviewed.
Yeah, if the price is right, the moon pies, the RC colas.
Let's start at the beginning, Dr. Boney. In 1784, the Georgia legislature granted the University of Georgia 40,000 acres and named a board of trustees. Who were the individuals involved, the movers and the shakers, behind that push for a university? Why was education so important to our forefathers, and how did they get things moving?
Well, Lyman Hall, the governor, was a Yale graduate, and Baldwin and Meigs, the two first presidents, were Yalees. So there was a lot of outside push for this. And some inside support too. John Millage, who was soon to be governor, gave the land that we own now. By world standards, there was a push in Georgia for advanced education. By American standards now, there wasn't much of a push. There were mostly outsiders who came in to set this up, and almost all Yalees. The 40,000 acres was for a college or seminary of learning, and then the next year, Baldwin got the charter for the University of Georgia. But then there was 15 years. Nothing happened until 1801 when Meigs came in as the first president. He was a Yalee too.
Why? Why did we have that long a period?
Well, this sounds harsh. Georgia was backward. Most of the state was held by Indians. It was the last of the 13 colonies. There were less than 200,000 people in the state, and a third of them were slaves. And so it was hard to get anything done. The government was shaky and disorganized. The 40,000 acres, some of that stuff just disappeared. You may find it hard to believe that in Georgia government some money might disappear, but I think it's mostly just poorly organized. When the Civil War started, there were only 100 students at the University of Georgia. In 1900, there were only 300 students. So things move slowly, but in our lifetime, things have really boomed. But glory to the guys who got it started, mostly outsiders.
So Abraham Baldwin and some of his peers and colleagues were just convinced of the importance of education and knew that we needed to do something.
Yeah, and of course they had to get Georgian votes to get it through the legislature. So, but they were the movers and shakers, and that's what it takes a lot of times, somebody to push it. And they had a background of college education from Yale, and a lot of Georgians didn't have that experience. Oh, Andrew Jackson didn't have it much later than that. Abraham Lincoln didn't have it. Harry Truman.
Talk a little bit about the Indians.
Well, the Creeks and the Cherokees controlled half of Georgia. We didn't muscle the Creeks out until the 20s and the Cherokees until the 30s. And there were still a few Indians around this area when this university was set up. I don't think they were much of a threat. I don't think the sheriff was really going to hack them with that sword.
I was going to say, thus the tradition that the sheriff would lead the commencement march into the commencement area, right?
I think in recent years it's been to control techie people who might disrupt commencement or something.
Oh, talk a little bit more. We were the first state-chartered institution in the country.
Yeah, the first chartered state university in 1785. We didn't actually get going until 1801. In the meantime, the Tar Heels, people who are good at copying things but not very original, they chartered and actually got their school started. So in a way, Chapel Hill has a good claim to be the first. We had the first charter, but they had the first classes actually functioning. And of course, Chapel Hill and UNC is still a fine school. We're
going to have to delete that from this tape, you understand, a reference to Chapel Hill. A number of other state institutions had early connections with the university, since we're starting about early beginnings. Talk about the relationships that the University of Georgia had with the State College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, several others. Let me just ask you one by one, and you talk about that one.
that's the A&M is complicated, which means I don't know what the hell I'm talking about half the time. But Georgia didn't become a federal land grant school until 1872. We were out of the Union when Lincoln set those things up. And we got in at the very last minute. If it delayed any longer, we wouldn't have been eligible. And so the University of Georgia, which had maybe 100 students when the Civil War started, went up to about 300 when it became a land grant school. That meant we got federal funds or script or federal financial support of one sort or another. From 1872 until the turn of the century, UGA took the land grant money and ran the old traditional liberal arts school and just had a token A&M school, almost a phantom.
Was it a separate institution, actually?
It was technically separate, but not entirely, again, which means I don't quite understand it. But
it was over on Ag Hill.
Well, not at first it wasn't. That was part of the trouble until George Foster Peabody and Chancellor Hill got started. It was slipped into the nooks and crannies of the old North Campus, and that was part of the problem. It wasn't a separate campus until the 20th century. Conor Hall was 1908, I think. And that's when they at least developed a separate campus. And that's when Sewell came in. That was Andrew Sewell.
Andrew Sewell. And he was actually the president of that particular entity. Is that what he was called?
He was the dean of the College of Education and the president of A&M School, and virtually independent, but not completely. And when he came here, he saw what had been going on, that the A&M school had been neglected. So he charged pretty hard. He was the proverbial bull in the china shop, but he had a good case, and he built up the ag school. He resigned in 1933 when the A&M school became the College of Agriculture and was subordinate completely to the major university. But until that time, the A&M school was largely independent, but not entirely. And people all thought of the whole thing as University of Georgia. Hill is the man that started doing a legit ag school, because the people of Georgia, who were mostly farmers or small town people, wanted to know what was going on with the A&M school. Why not a Clemson and Auburn? If the University of Georgia in Athens isn't going to take it seriously, let's move it to Tifton or Griffin and have a real A&M school. And Hill got the message, and that's when I don't think Sewell got here until after Hill died in 1905. He worked himself to death in 6 years. The first Georgia graduate ever to run the school, and the first non-Protestant minister in almost a century. And then David C. Barrow continued his programs.
And you said non-Protestant minister. You mean non-Protestant chancellor, don't you?
Yeah, well, it became chancellor in 1859 and became president again in 1933. But from the founding, after Meigs was booted out, everybody that led the university for the rest of the 19th century was a Protestant minister. For 40 years, Presbyterian ministers. And if a school can survive that, Sherman would be no problem. These were hardcore Calvinist Presbyterians, not the kind of moderate Presbyterians we have today. Waddle and then Alonzo Church. And they ran a very tight ship, very strict rules. And if you got out of line, they sent you away, expelled you. Robert Toombs was sent away by Moses Waddle, the first of the Presbyterian ministers. He came here in 1819 and retired in 1829. He incidentally was a Hampton-Sydney graduate. And I've always been impressed with Hampton-Sydney graduates, especially myself. At the end of the 19th century, two Hampton-Sydney graduates, Bocock and Hooper, came to teach Latin and Greek. And that was the last gasp of the old traditional liberal arts school with Greek and Latin required. Those rascals taught for half a century at the University of Georgia for the love of teaching, because the university and the state had no retirement system. You starved when you stopped teaching.
50 years.
50 years. There were 5 or 6 of them that at almost the end of World War II got certificates for teaching here for 50 years.
Goodness.
And then Hampton-Sydney had another major contribution in the 1960s, but modesty forbids me to go further with that.
I see.
Yes, you see all too well. This little dream world.
Okay, we'll talk about continuing along the line of other state institutions that had relationships with the university. How about the State Normal School? How were we?
Technically, it was a branch of the University of Georgia. It started in 1891 and ended when the Coordinate Campus was over there in 1933. Technically, it was a branch of the university. So was Georgia Tech, technically, but they both pretty much ran their own shows. The school at Delano was another branch, school at Milledgeville. But remember, this is in a period when the University of Georgia was very small, 300 or 400 students, and these branches were very small too. And there was a lot of complication and technicality, but there weren't a lot of students involved. Tech acted independently almost from the very beginning, but when we failed to get the School of Technology, the Institute of Technology here, it was clearly pretty clear it was going to be an independent operation in Atlanta. Usually when Atlanta and Athens have a tug of war over something, you can predict how it's going to end. We're going to get creamed.
Atlanta's going to come up the winner, huh? How about the Medical College of Georgia?
Yeah, that was, we were talking about that. It was listed as a department of the University of Georgia in the old Pandoras, but it was always at Augusta, and apparently it wasn't much of a med school in the 19th century. It was not fully accredited and all that sort of thing, but they got their act together after World War II, and I think it's a pretty fair country med school now, and we're going to be a part of it.
We're definitely going to cut that statement out of this.
What, the country school?
Yes, Talk about Lucy Cobb a little bit.
Well, Lucy Cobb was a prep school for women, young women, founded by T.R.R. Cobb and others, and it was named for his daughter who had died earlier. And it was a good, solid prep school in a college town.
Sort of a finishing school for ladies?
Yeah, but I think academically pretty respectable too. And
because women were not admitted to the University of Georgia until 1918.
Yeah, and Lucy Cobb continued to function until the Depression, and then it went under the university, took it over, and the building has had all kinds of uses since. The Lucy Cobb, funny, they had a statue of a goat in front of the school, and the first football mascot at the University of Georgia was a goat, so maybe there's a connection there.
Did I read in something that the girls there were sometimes called the goats?
Well, maybe I didn't know that, but yeah, they're called all sorts of things.
Doesn't sound very attractive.
But they, once 1918 came, they moved in large numbers into the university because it was a pretty solid prep school. And Miss Bill Tate's wife, Susan Tate, was a product of that.
Lucy Cobb girl. Yeah. A lot of the local women.
Oh yeah, and for its time, it was. Fairly impressive.
I think it was known certainly across the Southeast.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Of course, they didn't have much of a football team, so what can they make of
that? We didn't mention Georgia State. Was that something that's...
Yeah.
I think the Georgia Tech folks sort of claimed they...
Well, Tech, it was a branch of Tech for a while, and then it was a branch of Georgia for a while. But again, it became too big to be a branch or department of any other school. And now, of course, it's it's a pretty good school.
Huge.
Now they're going to have a football team.
That's right. Bill Curry.
Yeah, who's a good guy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Talk a little bit about, you mentioned the war, the Civil War.
The war, yes.
The war. Talk about the effect of the Civil War on the university and then the enrollment, what happened to us.
Well, the war started in April of 1861, and the senior class pretty much en masse went off to fight, but they went to their home counties and joined up. Benjamin Mell, who was the son of a professor here, joined a local unit, but there wasn't a UGA unit. 25 seniors in 1861, 7 of them didn't come back. The school staggered along until 1863. But by then, either all the students had volunteered or they were drafted. In the spring of '62, the Confederates started the first national draft. So by the middle of '63, Georgia had closed down and was used as a refugee center and sometimes Yankee POWs and various things. But it didn't open again until '66.
Okay, now there's a story about some of the Northern soldiers.
Oh yeah.
Making their home in Phi Kappa Hall and using it as a stable. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, remember, the Yankee soldiers were like rebel soldiers. They were mostly kids, 18, 19, 20 years old, away from home discipline. Yeah, there was a small garrison in Athens, and they did keep their horses in Phi Kappa, and they were accused of shooting at the buildings sometimes, and you won't believe this, American soldiers drinking and getting drunk. But, you know, put it in perspective, in the 1850s, there were several mass fights in Old College between what we would call the TAs and the students, in which they assaulted the TA rooms. It was like a war going on. So it wasn't as if the University of Georgia had been very well kept before the war. But of course, we resented occupation soldiers. That's what it mostly was. But during the war, the university, Sherman passed south through Madison. And there was this cavalry probe, which was sometimes called a battle locally, but it really wasn't. Nobody got killed. But Union soldiers didn't overrun UGA during the war. If they had, they probably wouldn't have done anything, maybe destroy the chemistry labs where they were plotting weapons of mass destruction or something. But normally they didn't destroy colleges or government buildings or courthouses. The destructiveness of Sherman's March has been exaggerated. By modern standards, it was a Sunday school picnic because they didn't rape and slaughter and murder. Mm-hmm. But of course, it was rough to have an enemy army roll through your countryside.
The university got moving again in 1866.
66.
How did that come about?
Well, they just struggled to reopen. The Union general in charge of the occupation was in Atlanta. And at the commencement of 67, one of these little peckerwoods in the junior class got up and gave a pro-rebel speech. At graduations, the seniors and some of the juniors gave short speeches. And you read it, it didn't think too bad, but it's kind of unreconstructed rebel stuff. And so the general in Atlanta ordered the place closed down. And Howell Cobb and some others talked him out of it. You know, these are just kids and they're just letting off steam. And so it continued to run.
Who was the president at the time?
Lipscomb, Andrew Lipscomb, who's a sad case. In 1859, he initiated a reform of the university to try to bring it up to snuff with modern universities. Now, this is the middle 19th century. That's when you first had a chancellor instead of a president, and that's true until 1933. The law school started in a very small way, but the rest of his reforms were wrecked by the war and by the poverty after the war. This mini GI Bill of Rights was passed by the legislature, which was very strict.
Georgia's legislature?
Yeah, Georgia's legislature. If you had served in the Confederate Army, and especially if you'd been shot up, for every year you'd served in the Army, you could get a little bit of a stipend at state schools. If you agreed to teach 1 year in Georgia, for every year you got this stipend. And enrollment at the University of Georgia went up to about 300. It had been 100 before the war. Most of these guys were not really eligible for college, and so they set up a high school at what would become the coordinate campus and the state normal school. And these kids studied there for a while, and then some of them came up to the main campus. But Lipscomb was impressed. They said, this is like a new race of students. They are mature, and they have gone out after school and done very well. And it sounds a lot like the GI Bill after World War II, that people who were a lot more mature than normal students. But this was a very small thing. And the university had cleverly put its meager endowment into Confederate bonds. And so that was
wasn't much left.
No. The state was not giving huge amounts of support to the University of Georgia because the state felt the university wasn't doing much for the state. And it really wasn't. Tiny little school. Emory, Oglethorpe, and Mercer were always also functioning by this time, and Wesleyan at Macon. And they had as many students as UGA did. And there was friction there. The church-related schools were opposed to the government-related funded school. And a lot of, especially in the last half of the 19th century, a lot of attacks came from the church schools that the University of Georgia was a den of iniquity with a lot of drinking. And you know that's not true.
Oh, no, certainly.
Georgia was accused of being a party school and a football factory. Now, how ridiculous can you get?
Well, let's leave the war. Let's talk a little bit. Let's go back and talk about admission of women. Women were not admitted to the University of Georgia until 1918.
Right after World War I. Yeah.
Talk about the timing of this, and maybe some early women graduates who possibly were the pioneers of this.
Mary Cresswell,
for whom Cresswell Hall was
yeah,
named.
Cresswell Hall was one of the. One of the strong supporters of this was Sewell at the Ag School, because the home ec program was going to be under his supervision, and he talked about the women help during the war effort. And another reason it came is because everybody else had already done it. All the surrounding state universities had admitted women long before this, except for the University of Virginia, which didn't admit women until the 1960s. They don't like to rush into things up there at Charlottesville. Chancellor Hill had not been opposed to admitting women, and Chancellor Barrow, his successor, was definitely not opposed to it and favored it, but I think a lot of the push came from Sewell. Also, the DAR and the UDC and these other wild radical groups were pushing it. And I wonder if people, Daughters of American Revolution and United Daughters of the Confederacy, I bet most students don't know what they are anymore.
Well, and that was at the same point at which the women's vote.
Yeah, that's right.
They that came in,
and this all was in the wind.
It was just time.
But of course, when I was in public schools in Richmond, I never had a male teacher through the whole junior high school. Women were still confined mostly to education and home ec in the higher education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I was a product of the Civil War era, a little old-fashioned.
Oh, this is a big jump. Talk about how Sanford Stadium was built and funded.
I didn't, you gave me a warning on that one, and I talked to the people over at Sanford Stadium. I didn't know this, but it was done by private subscription. Memorial Hall was too, but they had more trouble getting the money from people who pledged. But football came to the University of Georgia in 1892, and it was immensely popular from the very beginning. And by the 1920s, we had a serious athletic program, and we were playing powerhouses like Yale. Yale was a powerhouse then. They didn't have any trouble raising the money. It was 33,000 stands when it began. They used a lot of convict labor to work on the stadium, but that was done all over the South and in the North too. Very little mechanical stuff, real old-fashioned steam shovels, but mostly mules, convict labor, black labor, cheap white labor. There was sleds that mules would drag along to redistribute the dirt. When it was completed in 1829, it was a pretty little stadium that blended into Tanyard Branch and into the valley. Now, you don't even see the valley anymore. We appealed to Yale to come down and inaugurate the school because they were our parent institution. We had been playing Yale for a good number of years, but they didn't want to come down here into redneck Johnny Reb country. They might get lynched or something. And they agreed, okay, because we're the parent institution, we'll come down for the first time. And we beat the hell out of them, 15-0. Catfish Smith scored all the points. Albie Booth was their star. He was a little scatback. And it was a clean game, good hard-fought game, and there was no ill feeling or anything. And they were hugely welcomed when they came. And this was a great breakthrough to get a big Ivy League school to come into the deep, dark Dixie and play a football game. We didn't play Yale many more years after this. We got too strong for them. They had dominated the early part of the series, and then we began to dominate. And then we began to get into these regional alliances. The Yale came through again for us. George Herbert Walker Bush was vice president when we had our 200th anniversary, and he came down and gave a nice speech for that. So there's a faint.
He was a Yale man.
Yeah, he was a captain of the baseball team, and it was a nice speech. He didn't know anything about Georgia, but he had some research writers do it. But the Yaleys have even, maybe not anymore, but they had a little bit of a sense of obligation to this school because they had been the parent institution.
Well, now I heard there's some discussion, controversy over the Bulldog thing. The Yale mascot is a bulldog.
Yeah.
Our mascot is a bulldog, but my understanding is that that wasn't really why we were called bulldogs.
I'd always thought so. It seemed sort of logical that since we had patterned so much of ourselves, the curriculum and all after Yale, but maybe not. I don't know. I can't disprove
Some
it.
discussion about the fact, sports writer who said that we were like bulldogs when we fought and this was in the early 1900s, I think. But you know, there's some things that we'll never know exactly.
No, and sports writers are not likely to enlighten us much either.
Talk about the University of Georgia's connection with Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah, well, this was, well, of course, Roosevelt, the New Deal. Governor Gene Talmadge, an alumnus of the university, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. He feuded with FDR. Well, he feuded with everybody, but it was part of a states' rights versus central government thing. And as long as Governor Talmadge was in power, the federal building funds didn't get to the University of Georgia. Then in 37 to 41, I guess it was, there was a new governor. And then Talmadge came back in and created further havoc with the Cockling affair. But as long as Talmadge was governor, we didn't get those goodies. But once—
Are we talking about the PWA?
Yeah, PWA, the construction. Once he stepped down, though, we got 17 new buildings on campus. Baldwin, Park, LeConte, Snelling, the home demonstration houses over in the old Home Act building. So we got our share finally, but FDR was very popular in Georgia. Mr. Roosevelt, as people used to say, and you know,
well, the Warm Springs connection, I guess.
George Foster Peabody apparently knew Roosevelt well, and he was familiar. He'd been born down in that section, and I think he's the one that got him coming to Warm Springs, which became, and you know, he died in Warm Springs. The Phi Kappas went over there and made him an honorary member during this period. And the literary societies did this a lot. And it doesn't cost you anything to become an honorary member of Demosthenian or Phi Kappa. And he gave a commencement speech in '38 and was given an honorary degree. And then at the same time, though, he gave a speech elsewhere in Georgia in which he tried to get rid of Senator George. He attacked Senator George and encouraged Georgians to vote him out of office. And that you know, Georgians don't like to be told how to vote, or nobody else does either. And that boomeranged on Roosevelt, and George was reelected. But basically, Roosevelt was very popular in Georgia. And you know, how many Republicans would you find in Georgia during the Roosevelt administration?
That's for sure. Talk about the 1931 creation of the Board of Regents.
Well, this was Richard Russell, again an alumnus, the boy wonder governor who came in.
He was what, 33 years old?
Something like that, yeah. And he reorganized the state government at every level, and part of it was the educational system. And instead of all these branches and departments and vague lines of power between the different schools and endless tugs of war between the schools for the money, he created a central board of regents which would take care of all the money and dole it out to the schools. That didn't mean there wasn't still a struggle for the funds, but it was more controlled. Hughes, Spalding, and Philip Weltner, both alumni, were very instrumental in helping Russell set this up, and they were on the original board of regents, and UGA people were very dominant in the early years. I don't know that we are anymore, it's more spread out. But the University of Georgia became a unit within the broader state educational system. All of these schools were under that single board of regents. I think it was patterned after an Oregon program. I think I read that somewhere. But it made sense. The old system was patchwork quilt affair, and there were vague connections with the University of Georgia with a lot of the schools, but they were really independent. And a lot of money was wasted by duplication and this central board of regents. Now they've tinkered with it more. For a while, the governor was an ex officio member of the board of regents, and that caused trouble when Talmadge got to be governor again with the Cocking affair. But basically, the system has remained the same since, and it seems to work pretty well.
Talk about the Cocking affair a little bit and sort of set it up for us. What had happened?
Well, this was not long before World War II, and segregation was the law of the land in the South. And I can vision that very easily. I grew up in that. Separate water fountains, separate schools. And it's kids in school now don't know what the heck we're talking about when we describe that. But Cocking was a northerner. He wasn't a southerner. And he did a study of the separate but equal system in Georgia, in which he concluded pretty logically, yeah, it was separate, but it wasn't equal. And that was true in Virginia and everywhere else. But he didn't directly advocate integration, but he was very critical of separate but equal, and you could already see court decisions headed toward challenging all that.
Now, Cocking was the dean of the College of Education.
College of Education, and he wasn't a native Georgian, but he just told it like it was. One of his employees, a lady who, I don't think she was fired, but she didn't get promoted or something, and she went to Talmadge, who she knew, and complained about Cocking, and Talmadge went after him. And he pressured the Board of Regents, who he was a member of the Board of Regents, and he pressured them to fire Cocking. They voted to, then President Caldwell and Chancellor Sanford intervened to defend him. And I think Caldwell threatened to resign if they fired Cocking. In any event, then they backed off from that, and then Talmadge reapplied pressure, and they voted again to fire him. And Pittman down in South Georgia and a few others. The Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, the local or the regional accrediting agency, proclaimed this intolerable and voted as of September 42 that the white schools in the university system would lose their accreditation. The people of Georgia began to get concerned that Talmadge had gone too far with this, and Ellis Arnold, another alumnus of the University of Georgia, defeated Talmadge for the governorship and instituted reforms, including a couple of state constitutional amendments, which strengthened the independence of the regents. And the accrediting agency retroactively lifted the loss of accreditation, and we were saved. But it was a bad PR mess. It made Georgia look like, you know, Podunk University or Godzilla Lake or Tobacco Road or something. And Talmadge, you know, he was not hostile to the University of Georgia, but he caused us a lot of trouble.
We've had a couple of our previous interviews where they regularly lynched the governor.
Yeah, on campus.
Yeah, on campus. So
it's funny, his son Herman Talmadge, became governor after World War II when he controlled the National Guard. There were 3 claimants, and Herman had the guns. And he was a graduate of here, and he was one of the people who directed the little commencement spring dance. He was a big man on campus. Anyway, he was extremely good to the University of Georgia. A lot of money flowed over here when Herman Talmadge was governor. And let's face it, almost all the governors are bulldogs. It's very rare.
I think 25 since, what, 1856, something like that?
Lester Maddox, Jimmy Carter, a few others.
That were not. Yeah. They were not.
Purdue is a PhD in vet medicine. He's not just a BA or BS guy.
We mentioned that there are a number of references that have come up from those folks that we've interviewed, and things that we think it might be good to further explain and clarify. Can I run some of those by you?
Yeah, I can probably them.
You just mentioned Little Commencement.
Yeah,
Tell us what Little Commencement, describe it, and then if you have any idea about the origin or how it began.
No, I think basically it was the formal spring dance and a big thing socially. And it was close to commencement, so that's why they called it Little Commencement. And as I said, Herman Talmadge was a big man on campus, and that was one of the things he honchoed, was the spring.
Lots of big bands and...
Yeah, that sort of thing. And you know, a lot of students couldn't afford all that. People tend to forget that. And they tended to be probably Greek-dominated, but fancy balls.
That may be as good an explanation as any for why it was Little Commencement. Because it was around the time of commencement, and it was so it was Little Commencement.
A good guess.
Bill,
anyway.
Is that all right with you? Okay. Talk about some other of these things. What was Camp Wilkins?
Camp Wilkins was built early in the 1920s when the ag school was, you know, getting its fair share of money, and it was built primarily, I think, for 4-H activities in the summer. And also before commencement, a week or two before commencement, a lot of the mothers of people who were going to graduate from the ag school came up and lived in Camp Wilkins for a week or two and got some, you know, canning vegetables and home ec and farming stuff. And then they were able to see their kids graduate. During the regular session, it became a dormitory and chow hall for people who couldn't afford expensive facilities. And really, it was the ag students who lived in Camp Wilkins and ate their chow there, and they became a political power, like the Greeks and other organizations.
Where was Camp Wilkins?
It's where the vet school is now, the addition.
Okay.
It was torn down in 1966. Just before it was torn down, I think they had some programs over there where they put people in isolation there just to see how they acted. They acted strangely, but that was just temporary. And then they tore it down in '66 to make way for the expansion of the vet school, which strangely had been abolished in the 1930s and then was reinstituted after World War II. And, you know, gosh, we needed a vet school.
Abolished because it just
lack
didn't
of
have
interest.
enough?
Yeah, that's what they say, and also maybe lack of funds. And as you remember, Fred Davidson was dean of the ag school before he became
Dean of Vet Medicine.
Vet Medicine, yeah, and then he was chancellor's assistant, and then he came back here as president.
What was the beanery?
This was Denmark Hall over on the North Campus. It was built, I think, 1901, but somewhere around there. It was the chow hall for the main campus, and I haven't run into a lot of complaints about the food, which is very unusual. You know darn well it isn't going to be all that fancy, but it apparently was plentiful, cheap, inexpensive food, and that's what the environmental design people run that building now.
How about the co-op?
The co-op was the student snack bar in New College. One side on the first floor was the co-op, and on the other side was the student bookstore. And the school was still pretty small. And then the student snack bar went over to Memorial Hall, where they served French fries as greasy as the varsities. I didn't think that was possible, but they matched it.
So it's where everybody hung out?
Yeah, kind of a hangout place. There's a picture there, and I guess it's around 1940, ham sandwich, 5 cents. So you know it.
Yeah, that was a while ago.
Make you cry.
Oh my. How about, you mentioned Coordinate Campus, and we've had a number of people who talked about living out on Coordinate Campus, which of course is out where the current Navy School is on Prince Avenue. Why was there a Coordinate Campus?
Well, remember that original area had Lipscomb had wanted to put the freshman and sophomore males out there. And then he changed his mind because they protested bitterly. They wanted to be on the main campus, and then it became a high school. And the ladies protested bitterly too. They wanted to be back on the main campus. They were it felt like sort of you were second class out there, a little.
Well, now the normal school was out there.
Yeah, but
so was the idea that
when the normal school closed, when the Regents took over, and then it
Right.
became the Coordinate Campus until the Navy School came.
was that because they didn't have a place to house women on the main campus, or
I
it
think
was,
housing mainly.
or it was a good way to keep the boys and the girls separate?
Well, it didn't work if that was.
That's what we hear.
You know, it's sort of scary that in the Pandoras you see girls hitchhiking from a Coordinate. Boy, you do that now. Lots of luck.
Let's talk about some traditions. Give us a little bit of the history of the arch, and talk about where the tradition came that a freshman should not pass under the arch.
Well, the arch was built. Alonzo Church was the second of the Presbyterian ministers, was president here for 30 years. And in the latter part of his administration, he was a little too conservative. Lipscomb was a remedy for that. And the school enrollment began to decline a little, and they lost a couple of the LeConte brothers left, and they were first-rate scientists. In any event, he retired at that time, 1859, 1858, and as sort of a, I don't know, I guess sort of a token to placate him, they sold the Memorial Garden up on Millage Avenue and took that money and built the fence with the arch on it. And somebody asked me what happened to the gates, and I wondered maybe they never had gates, but anyway, the gates disappeared. I often wondered, why didn't they tear that down and make it into guns during the Civil War?
That was...
Maybe that's why we lost the war. The tradition of freshmen not walking under the arch, I came here in the 60s. I don't know if I even noticed it even being enforced. But this is just typical of the kind of stuff that went on in all schools, like wearing the little beanie hats and
rat caps.
Yeah, and the shirt tail parade where the freshman men had to take their pants off, but thank God not their underpants, and would parade around town. The senior parade, the senior parade was enforced by the 1920s, and the seniors would, I think at first, old Sanford Field before the stadium, before the home game with Georgia Tech, they'd come down there dressed in funny costumes and all this sort of thing. And on one of those cases, they had a float intimating that Georgia Tech was yellow during the First World War. And we counseled athletic relations for 7 years over that. The senior parade became an institution at the homecoming game in Sanford Stadium. And I think the main reason, it just got too big. There were too many seniors. But there was an incident. The Mississippi team was playing Georgia for the homecoming game, and you're not going to believe this, but some of the seniors appeared to have been drinking. And they harassed the Mississippi cheerleaders. I don't see anything wrong with that. That seems to be a normal.
I actually was there, and there was a sign that went around the field that was probably part of the reason that they carried.
Oh, what did it say?
I'm not going to say that on film.
Gosh, they could have beaten up Trent Lott. You know,
I will tell you later what it said.
But it was, the boys dressed in those big black cowboy hats.
Canes
and the canes, and the girls were dressed nice, and it was kind of nice, but it just got too big and got out of hand.
I think that's part of it. I think you're right. Let's go back and talk about another wartime. It looks like we have lots of war times to talk about, sadly. Discuss wartime on campus, and this time World War II. And
World War II, yeah.
The Navy Preflight School, and what kind of physical changes to campus?
Well, the Navy Preflight, there was some Army programs, small ones, but the Navy Preflight program came in June of '42 and stayed for the rest of the war. 6,000 naval pre-flight officers were rotated through there, I think in 6-month sequences. So there were about 6,000 on campus rotating through every 3 months. These were guys who were going to fly off aircraft carriers in the Pacific. And this was kind of orientation to learn the traditions of the Navy and to get in physical shape and all. And they didn't like it much because they wanted to fly and go out and take on the Japs, but Japanese. A lot of remember Russell Baker, who used to write the humor column? He was a pre-flight cadet here, and in his memoir, he has a funny little chapter about his unsuccessful love life in Athens. Ed McMahon, Johnny Carson's sidekick, was here, and a lot of the pre-flighters were not from the South. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but they were a lot of from the Midwest and other areas, and this was their first trip to the Deep South. And they were astonished at the withering heat. They had never seen many black people before, and they talked about these cloudburst rains. But mainly they didn't like it too much because they wanted to get on with their war. A lot of buildings were renovated. Old College was completely redone inside. Now we've redone it again. And the architects had some trouble trying to figure out how it was originally because the Navy changed it so much. Memorial Hall was added on to Baldwin Hall. A chow hall was put on the back. Stegman Hall, the gym and swimming pool was there because they had to teach these guys how to swim if they.
So they built Stegman Hall.
Yeah, they built Stegman Hall. At the end of the war, the Navy took some payment, but way under what we got a great bargain out of all this. Michael Gelfand, one of our grad students, did an MA thesis on the Navy pre-flight program at Georgia, and that's beautifully done in great detail. If you're really interested in that as to research it, go take a look at that.
Okay. GI Bill of Rights again.
Yeah, yeah.
How it affected us here.
Oh boy, it affected me after the Korean War. This was passed during World War II, and at the end of the war, with a formula depending on how much service you'd had and all this sort of thing, you got a government scholarship to go to college. And huge numbers of people went to college who had never dreamed of it before. For the first time in a family's history, somebody got to go to college. A few women who had been in the service were eligible for that too, but it was overwhelmingly a men's program. These were older, more mature people, like the people Lipscomb talked about after the Civil War. They were more mature. Now, you did get some people who went 1 year on the GI Bill and flunked everything they took and partied the whole time and then just left, no hard feelings. But most of them took it very seriously. And somewhere in there, the American male concluded that it was better to work with a coat and tie on in an air-conditioned office than in some sweltering cotton patch. And a huge shift toward non-blue-collar work by people who had been in blue-collar, the redneck culture of Georgia. People had farmed for generations. Now a lot of these people were moving into offices. And I don't know, I sometimes think we have too much of a paper culture now, and maybe the GI Bill encouraged that some, but it sure raised educational levels.
And it swelled the enrollment here substantially.
Oh yeah, it went up to about 8,000 from, during the war there were only about 2,000 here, almost all women. And before the war it had been about 3,000. Then it went up to about 8,000, and when the GIs left it went back to about 5, and then started growing later.
The baby boomers, I guess maybe.
Yeah, and you had these temporary married student housing developments on all these big campuses, and architecturally they were an embarrassment, but they were like another scholarship. I lived in Copley Hill at UVA, and they weren't much more than glorified chicken coops, but they did the job. And they were like another scholarship besides the GI Bill.
We had the prefabs here.
Yeah, yeah.
Were the prefabs here when you got here in '68?
I don't think so. If they were, I didn't see them. Yeah, the Copley Hill, they called them trailers. They'd been used for war workers at Norfolk before the war, and they ended up chicken coops out on farms after. But UVA, particularly with Mr. Jefferson's architecture and all, was very uncomfortable with these seedy-looking residences.
Now, the prefabs were not much either.
No, no.
So talk a little bit about how the George Foster Peabody Awards came about.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about that. Apparently in 1940, that Dean Jury had a lot to do with it, but Sanford by this time was chancellor of the whole system. But you know, Sanford, he was sometimes compared to FDR as far as being a executive and administrator and a shrewd politician. Apparently they developed it, and at first the Board of Regents decided who won these radio awards. But can you imagine the Board of Regents giving those awards now? Minnie Pearl, Elvis Presley. They later transferred them, you know, to professionals, and later added television. And that's been a great boon to the University of Georgia, because a lot of people in those times especially would have said, well, UGA is just a football factory and a party school. And we were beginning to get into things. Columbia controls the Pulitzer Prizes, and that's, you'd expect an Ivy sort of school to do that sort of thing. But it was in honor of George Foster Peabody, who's probably the greatest benefactor the school has ever had. And until 1901, he never set foot on the campus. But he was born in Georgia.
I was going to ask you about him in a minute. Talk about the funding for the main library, the Isla Dunlap Little Memorial Library.
Well, she left in her will. I think her husband was an alumnus of the school, but anyway, he died first.
So she had not attended the university?
I don't think so. I'm not sure about that, but it was $400,000 bequest, and that was some serious money now. Lord, that wouldn't run the Visitor Center for a week now. But what is it? Dirksen said, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Soon you're getting into some real money. But $400,000 was a lot of money back in the right after World War II, and that wasn't the total amount. The state would supplement it. But she demanded columns all the way around, and that's very expensive, and it's very inefficient. You know, those columns on the academic building must have cost us a fortune every time when the weather changes, the paint pops off, and they're up there painting them again. But anyway, they got around it by putting a few columns in the front and these little semi-columns all the way around, and $400,000 plus state money. And then the addition in 1973 was much bigger than the original library. And we have quite a good library now.
Talk about our library a little bit. How many books? 4 million now?
Oh yeah, I guess. But with the internet connections, in a way, it doesn't much matter anymore. George Foster Peabody put up the money, I think it was $60,000 for the first real library, which was became the museum and now the administration building. And soon after we got that first real library, early in the 20th century, we were allowed to give Phi Beta Kappa. That made us eligible. You know, to give Phi Beta Kappa, you have to have certain facilities and meet certain standards. And that was adequate through the 20s and 30s, but it became inadequate after World War II. And then the 54 library. Now, another deal with that was to tear down the Chancellor's house. And I don't know if you can get away with that now. You probably...
Well, I never understood why that was part of that. Was it was 100 years old, I understand, when they tore it down. So maybe it was at a point that it... I
think it was pretty beat up. But on the other hand, Old College was pretty beat up, and they renovated that around the turn of the century. Chancellor Hill wanted to tear it down. And there was what we called historic preservation movement in 1908. And they patched it up together, back together. That was primitive. Barbara Dooley talked once about when she and Vince went to Auburn, and you know, I went to Hammond City and y'all went here, said students wouldn't believe how primitive facilities were when they were in college compared to what that we have now. And that's true.
Talk about the admission of the first African-American students to the university against the background of the national scene and the political landscape in Georgia. Help us understand that.
Well, this is very hard to explain to students now. They just don't visualize a segregated society, and you and I can visualize it. But rigid segregation, sort of, and yet, you know, we excluded blacks from schools and drinking fountains and waiting rooms, but we let them raise our kids. So it was always sort of a strange thing. But the 54 decision outlawing segregation was resisted all over the South, and all of the southern states stalled. Virginia, the same way. And you couldn't win, or you couldn't survive politically if you didn't defend segregation. And Vanderbilt was governor here in Georgia. His daughter's one of the local honchos in the Democratic Party. And he took the usual stand that he wouldn't allow integration. He'd close the schools first. But when the crunch came, they didn't do this. They backed down from it and allowed integration. The first real breach in Georgia was on this campus in January of 1961. Charlene Hunter and now Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes were transfer students. He'd been at Morehouse and she'd been at Wayne State up in Detroit. And they came in as juniors, as a lot of students still do. They were very carefully picked. They were very bright and very thick-skinned and resourceful. They came in January of 1961. They registered in the academic building, which is now named for them. And there was a good bit of media turnout for that, and a good deal of hostility from the students. They registered and they began classes. And just a few days later, we lost a game to Georgia Tech in Old Woodruff Hall, and the crowd was mad about that. But I think there'd been some pre-preparation too. They marched on Maya Central, where Charlene Hunter lived. The women's rules required that she live on campus. Hamilton Holmes lived in the black community in town because he could. But anyway, the crowd or mob surrounded Maya Central and began to throw some rocks through the windows, and the Athens cops and firemen and Dean Tate and the education dean Wilson, no, I think that's wrong. Williams, yeah. They all arrived. Dean Tate got punched out, but he survived, and they scattered the demonstration, and that was the end of any open violence. Bob Pratt, the present chairman of the history department, has a book that summarizes all this. It could have been worse. Somebody could have gotten shot. It was, thank God for Alabama and Mississippi. They got worse PR.
They were worse. And Arkansas, I guess.
Yeah, Arkansas too. Vanderbilt steadied things. I mean, his record doesn't look so impressive until you remember what the climate of opinion was then. And he did not close the schools. And integration proceeded, but rather slowly. But that was the first major breach. And the Clark County schools, I don't think integrated until about 1970. I mean, it was a slow process.
Actually, my senior class was integrated, and it was 1965.
65 started then, okay.
So
yeah, well, I think 70 is when Cedar Shoals started, the Harvard of Clark County. Yeah, my kids. Carl Vippelman's son was in the first class that integrated at Clark Central, and there was nothing serious, but some fights and stuff like that. It was a tough time. If you were white, you didn't have anything to do with Holmes and Hunter. You might not curse at them or try and hit them or something, but if you didn't ostracize them, you might get ostracized. And there were a couple of federal marshals on campus for the rest of that year. Nothing else happened. But they didn't have an easy time of it. And 2 years later, they graduated. He was a history major in Phi Beta, and she was journalism, both very bright. In the meantime, early, a lady who transferred in from Michigan got a graduate degree a year ahead of that. So she was the first to get a graduate degree in music therapy. And Richard Green, the first black professor here, was hired in that field just a few years later, just a coincidence. They later became very supportive of the university, especially Hamilton Holmes, but both of them. And this is an interesting phenomenon that people who have a very rough time at schools sometimes become the most loyal alumni. And people who breeze through and have everything their way do nothing for the old school. It's funny. I think it has some connection with marriage too. I see similarities there. But,
talk about the philosophy of in loco parentis and the changes that came about on campus, University of Georgia, particularly in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Well, when I was in school, I finished Hampton-Sydney in '52, and of course the schools and colleges were the parents. You know, they had tremendous power, and nobody challenged it. The parents or the students either. But by the 60s, that kind of stuff was being challenged. And a school like Georgia, I guess, was particularly vulnerable because there were a lot of restrictions on women. Dress code, how long you could stay out of the dorm, you had to live on campus and all this sort of thing. People have forgotten, but the first big demonstration at UGA in '68 was for women's rights. It wasn't for the Vietnam War. The administration, then Fred Davidson was president, and George Parthimus was what we'd call provost. And these were old school guys. They weren't opposed to that sort of thing, but you know, they weren't going around high-fiving people and whatever you call that. And it was hard for people like that to handle it. It would have been very hard for me to handle it too. But we came through it okay. The demonstrations, all of the demonstrations at UGA were relatively mild. Nothing serious, no burning of buildings, and nobody getting hurt, and no troops called in, anything like that. But that changed things. Well, remember Dean Tate? He was Dean of Men, and he was sort of the parent on campus until that time. And then the universities backed off. I think in a way they were glad to back off and not have that responsibility anymore. Well, you know, 18-year-olds were drafted to fight, and in Georgia and Kentucky, the idea was if you were old enough to fight, you should be able to drink and vote. And so, you know, you ought to be free of university control, at least in some areas.
Nash, talk a little bit about the Jan Kemp affair and how it affected the University of Georgia and the rest of the country.
Well, that was late in Fred Davidson's administration. Had a good bit to do with ending it, actually. She was in developmental studies, an instructor in developmental studies, that is remedial studies, and a good number of the kids in that were athletes on scholarship. And she complained that some of the football players or some of the scholarship athletes were being passed when they shouldn't pass. And she was fired for that, and she went to court. went to federal court with it. She had a good case, and she also had a good lawyer, the Hugh Henry in town, was sharp on this sort of thing. It dragged on for a couple of years, and it ended up in federal district court. And it's sort of an irony, the black judge who heard this case, and I think was quite fair, had been turned down years before for Georgia Law School and had been accepted at Vanderbilt. So he was, you know, had some connection with the University of Georgia. But I don't know, I think the university didn't handle it very well. They tried to run roughshod over her. Just a big institution, the law school, the athletic department, the university administration. And they just figured they'd wear her out. But boy, she doesn't wear her out. She's a tough lady. And she hung in there. And I don't know, but I imagine her lawyer probably was on a contingency basis. You know, would take a share if they won, take nothing if they didn't. But in any event, she won a settlement of $1 million, 10% of which she gave to her church.
And she was supposed to continue, and she was able to come back to
yeah,
the university.
Yeah.
Was that
People
correct? Forget
that she was a great admirer of Vince Dooley and a fierce supporter of the Georgia football team. My wife taught two kids at Cedar Shoals, and she and Jan Kemp and one or two of the kids went to France on a little quick tour. Mm-hmm. And she's a perfectly normal person, but just tough. And you know, you just better be careful who you try to push around. I know her slightly, and she's an interesting lady, real tall. You can't miss her in a crowd. But I think what happened ultimately was very good for the university, because occasionally the athletic department has to be hit in the head with a 2x4 and told, stop. You know, the Herrick mess. Once in a while it gets out of control. It's big time athletics, and it's overemphasized, but that's not going to change. And our record overall is not bad, but when you have this high pressure athletics and when you're competing with teams that play pretty fast and loose with the rules, it's very tempting to play fast and loose yourself. I think we're very fortunate. I think Dooley was quite good in this respect, and I think Rick is too. But it's a tough life in football because you're competing with some teams that have very vague standards.
Do you think that it affected other programs across the country when this happened?
I think so. I think it got people's attention.
Certainly when the president ended up basically resigning.
Yeah, because within a year Davidson had resigned. And that was sad because I think Davidson was a very good president and did a lot of good things. But when he was president here for almost 20 years, and in 20 years you're going to make some missteps.
Talk about what led up to that resignation. There was the Board of Regents did not renew his contract.
Yeah, he was pressured out. You know, when you've been president of a school like this for almost 20 years, you've made a lot of enemies. I thought, for example, Knapp retired after about 10 years, and I suspect he was beginning to feel that. If you run a efficient administration, you're going to get people mad at you. And Adams has had about that much time now. But Davidson and Anna Holton Caldwell were in for almost 20 years each. And there were times of huge change, and they were under a lot of pressure. And I think they just made the wrong calls in Jan Kemp's case. But in most cases, you get away with something like that. A person would just give up on it and say, you know, I got something better to do with my life. But I think it was good for the university, and again, Jan Kemp had nothing but good things to say about Coach Dooley, and she's a loyal Bulldog fan.
To this day?
Yeah, she's expecting a national championship, I'm sure, this year.
What 4 or 5 events from your perspective had the greatest impact on the University of Georgia?
Yeah, I brought this list because I don't want to forget anything. The founding, Baldwin and Meigs, who directed that, and the founding is always important. The revival under Waddell, not Waddell, but Waddell. The University of Georgia had just about died after Meigs was fired, and they had a few temporary leaders. In Tom Dyer's book, he says it may well have died. It may have even had to start over. But anyway, he revived it in 10 years. And that was impressive.
About what year was that?
1819 he came and he retired to go back to preaching in 1829. His son was on the faculty after that, and he added the extra L to the name. The Civil War, just by the very nature of the war, becoming a land-grant college in 1872, the effect immediately was more money. And you could make the case that the university would have gone bankrupt without the federal land-grant system, which is ironic because Yankees were hated, but Yankee money, that's a different story. Mm-hmm. I know some people who still feel that way, who will remain nameless. The beginning of the modern university under Walter B. Hill, that was coming. That was the trend all over the country, but Hill in 6 years is the one who really shifted that into a high gear with a lot of help from George Foster Peabody. He's the one that first got Peabody involved in the University of Georgia, and David C. Barrow continued that program. You can't exaggerate the importance of George Foster Peabody to this school when it needed a lot of help. The admission of women in 1918, we've talked about that, and that enrollment went over 1,000 for the first time then. Now the percentage is 57% women, and that's just about the national average, from 57 to 60%. The law school, the incoming class is about 50-50. The vet school is about 75% women. You go over there now, you don't see any men. It's like a harem or something over there. And the vet school has shifted from large animal farm animals to small animals, and that's another noticeable shift. We have all kinds of dogs, and the lady vets do a good job for a fee, of course. Setting up the Regents system under boy Governor Richard Russell, that certainly was important. Integration, we've talked on that some. World War II and the GI Bill of Rights. And then I just put down for 10 and 11 the huge expansion of the University of Georgia, especially under Ada Holt Davidson in that area, and the expanded reputation of the University of Georgia. We really are a national and international university now. And you know, you can get a little carried away with the PR, but we've got a real solid school here. A school the football team can be proud of.
Well, along those same lines, what individuals had the greatest impact on the university?
It's similar. Baldwin Meggs, because they started the school and set it up on the Yale system, and without them it wouldn't have started. Oh, maybe it would have started with somebody else, but maybe not. Waddell, because he resurrected the school. Walter B. Hill, because he really started the university as opposed to the college. I put Stedman v. Sanford as one of the this guy did everything. How many times does a guy come to the University of Georgia from Mercer to teach English? These guys, like all history, these guys don't shake the world. But he founded the journalism school. He was chairman of the athletic committee for decades. He was, let's see, was he dean too? Yeah, dean of journalism. Then he was president of the university, and then he was chancellor of the whole system. He was president in the very early years of the new Regents system, and then from 35 to 45, he was chancellor of the whole system. Steve Gurr, one of our history majors, has done a biography of Sanford, and he's an extremely impressive guy, and some people compare him to Franklin D. Roosevelt in his executive leadership. And he just looks like a typical college professor. You know, you've seen one college professor, you've seen them all, but he was an exceptional guy.
We were lucky to have him.
Yeah, we were. We were. And then I put Fred Davidson as the fifth, and that was a tough call because Caldwell was president for 20 years before, during, and after World War II. Then Ada Holt was almost 20 years after World War II until 67, and then Davidson from 67 to 86. And with the Jan Kemp affair wasn't his finest hour, but he presided over a very rapidly growing university with all the disruptions and all this sort of thing. And he was a traditional sort of guy. It's funny, his father was from New Jersey and his mother was a Brit, but he was about as Georgian as you could get. And he was a formal fella. He was always in a coat and tie, and some of the informality of the 60s and the 70s are bound to have shaken him a little. But I never got to know him very well until in the Carter administration, he commissioned 6 of us in the history department to do a history of Georgia. And of course, it was a brilliant work. But by the time it came out, Carter was president, so invited us to come up to the White House and, you know, have a little ceremony. And Ralph Stevens, the director of the press, and Fred Davidson went along. And gosh, what a delightful guy when you got to know him. But as president of the university, he was fairly remote, but that was the way presidents were supposed to be back in that age. And he was caught in that age of rapid change. But my wife taught at least one of his kids at Athens Academy. Just a nice family. I'm glad they named the science building after him before he died, because he had earned it.
Well, and I think that was a part of his foresight.
Yeah.
He had this vision that the technology and the science was going to be the way that we would be moving.
And he was a vet. You know, he was a scientist himself. Right. But Caldwell, you could make a good case for, and then Adderholt. Caldwell not only was president for a long time in all that hassle with Talmadge, but then he was a long-time chancellor of the university. So maybe I'm not being fair to him, but close call. But then the others, like Paul Lipscomb, who wanted to reform the university, but then the Civil War came along and he wasn't able to get anything done. The talent was there, but the material was lacking. And
you mentioned George Foster Peabody. He was an important and one of the early donors to the university.
Oh yeah, given modern the value of money now, he gave enormous amounts of money. His parents were from the North, and before the Civil War they settled in southwestern Georgia and ran a business store. So he was born in Georgia, but after the Civil War times were hard, so they moved back north. And he had equivalent of a high school education and became a fabulously wealthy investment banker. Knew all the high rollers, FDR. He's the one that got FDR interested in Warm Springs. And he didn't even set foot on the University of Georgia until early in the 20th century under Hill. And he was very influential without any kind of title for the next 20. He died in, I think, 1938. And some people claim that he was sort of a gray eminence, a shadow. But the shadow carried a lot of money around with him, so he couldn't have done much more for the university than he did. He's the one that bought the South Campus to set up the agriculture, a real A&M school, physically separate from the rest of the university. But he did it all.
I think the only thing that we've not touched on that we mentioned earlier was to talk about Title IX.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And how it has affected the university.
Well, I think Dooley, as athletic director, and his assistant Liz Murphy really handled that well, because that's, you know, you had to close some programs down, men programs especially, in order to create women's programs. And it doesn't have to be 50-50, I don't think, but it, you know, has to be comparable. And I think they did a pretty good job of bringing in the people to, like Suzanne Yucklin. My gosh, you can't do much better than that. Bally and swimming, women's swimming. The women's tennis team, I think they've all done well, but back of it all is the financial juggernaut of football. That without football, the whole thing collapses. I guess maybe basketball in good years and women and men would carry their own way, but most of these programs don't make money. And I think it's been handled pretty well. They always, even before Title IX, everybody thought in the athletic department thought they weren't getting their fair share of the money, and that's just normal equivalent. You see that in academic departments too. The only person I know that was consistently underpaid was
it's you.
Yeah, I mean, a man of genius. Oh yeah, yeah.
Talk about the Lecontes.
Well, the Lecontes were a French Huguenot background, as my wife frequently reminds me. And you know, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, Huguenots fled in all directions. Huge amounts of talent went to Germany and came back in the German army in 1940 to Britain, and a lot of them settled in America. Not huge numbers, but the Lecontes. their father was a very rich planter. They owned over 100 slaves, and they were both students at the University of Georgia, but did advanced studies in the North. And they both came to teach at the University of Georgia in the 1850s, but Alonzo Church was the president, and he was getting on in years and very rigid and conservative. And so they left. And some other talent left at that time. But there were only about 10 profs. So.
Did they start at the University of California? Is that my...
Sort of. During the war, they used their scientific expertise to make Confederate gunpowder, and they served the Confederate. And after the war, they lived mostly in South Carolina, but times were hard, so they moved west. And they did. They were among the people who founded the University of California. I wonder if the people at Berkeley know that some of the founders were big slaveholders and Johnny Rebs. I don't think that's been widely published.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and they were big in the Sierra Club, environmentalism, stuff like that. I think it's Robert and John, I think were the names, and Robert was a little better known. Joseph, you're right, you're Joseph. Lester Stevens in our department has written a lot on those guys. Okay. And they were serious scientists of that age, and they were probably the best scientists the University of Georgia had up to that time, and too bad to lose them.
Church wasn't much on science. This was one of the criticisms. They were dealing with the things of God.
Yeah, and church wasn't much on research and publication, and the LeContes were among the first who were interested in doing something besides teaching. And for example, in the 1850s, the faculty had to patrol the campus and maintain order, and Lord, they hated that. And so the LeContes left. But you know, people leave. And
they have found South Carolina College.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Well, it existed before that. South Carolina came very soon after we did.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, they also sometimes claim to be the first. So talk a little bit about Hurdy.
Oh, Charles H. Hurdy. He was
Speaking of outstanding scientists.
Yeah, he was a Milledgeville student, a very good student, and he liked athletics. And you could play pickup games and play neighborhood teams and all that sort of thing, but there was no intercollegiate sports. He went, I think he went to UNC and got his PhD. And then he returned as a professor of chemistry. But remember, the school is less than 300, and the only way you could get promoted is if the guy ahead of you died, and Professor Clay wouldn't die. And so Hurdy was restive and finally left. But while he was there, he brought intercollegiate sports to the University of Georgia, especially football, and that was an immediate success.
He also had something to do with the pulpwood industry.
Oh yeah, the pine industry in Georgia and the South he's as much responsible for that as anybody. If he could only figure out a word for what's something to do with kudzu now, we'd be in business.
Isn't that the truth?
But he was an impressive guy, and he just really, I mean, bringing athletics to Georgia is a footnote in his career. He was a distinguished scientist.
What have we left out? What have we not talked about that we need to talk about?
My publications, my overwork and underpay, my boyhood in Virginia. I guess I better drop this.
Have we touched everything?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Nash, please tell Fran, why is it important that we learn or study, or is it important that we learn or study the history of this institution?
Well, you know, I went through Hampton City and UVA and never studied the history of those schools. Especially UVA, it would have been interesting because of the Jefferson and connection and big university. Yeah, I think it's useful, but most people go through school with knowing very little about the school. A lot of schools have commissioned distinguished professors on their staff to do histories of the schools. And to put it bluntly, a lot of them aren't very well done because they didn't want to do it. They were forced to do it. An exception is Tom Dyer's University of Georgia Bicentennial History. That's very well done. And unfortunately, it stops in 1984. That was done for the bicentennial. I think if you suggested him add another chapter, he'd probably assault you physically, because from 84 to now is a tough time to cover.
Lots happening.
Oh yeah, but the history of the University of Virginia or Georgia or even little small schools like Hampton-Sydney is a microcosm of what's going on around them. And a lot of these university histories are too isolated. They don't take into account what's going on around. Isn't there an introductory course in the university that touches a little on university history?
Contemporary.
It used to be a course on that Phyllis Barra taught about state history, but I'm not sure that's even in the catalog anymore.
It's
I
a
doubt it.
part of contemporary Georgia.
The history department has very few people now in Southern history. I think when I was there, we probably had too many. But I regret we don't have a few more now.
How about Merton Coulter?
Yeah, he came here in the 20s from UNC. He was a Tar Heel. Very unusual for Tar Heels to attain any distinction, but you know, it occasionally happens. He was one of the first persons on campus with a few of the scientists who had publishing and national reputations from research. Apparently, he was also a very good teacher. The students loved his lectures.
And he was here forever.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, he edited the Georgia Historical Review for 50 years. I used to go up, he had an office in Phi Kappa down on the first floor. I used to go up there and talk with him because I understood where he was coming from. He was a traditional Southern conservative segregationist. He was born that way, and you know, he wasn't stupid or anything. It was his mindset. And he knew his fields enormously, and I used to, a lot of times we'd have students from the Ivy League or from North or somewhere coming down here to do research, and I'd always send them up to talk to Dr. Coulter, and he did help them academically. He knew all kinds of stuff, but they were like talking to a relic from another age. And I don't mean to put him down, that was just the mindset if you'd gone through a college in the 1910s and 1920s in the Deep South. He published an enormous amount, and it's held up pretty well.
College life in the Old South?
Yeah, which is really only Georgia up to 1870. But he did a book on the Civil War, which I think is pretty good. He did one on Reconstruction that he caught a lot of static for because it wasn't, it was too pro-Southern. But that's the way.
Those rascal carpetbaggers?
Yeah, this sort of thing. Blacks and carpetbaggers and sort of Birth of a Nation stuff, although. But you know, it's easy to poke fun at, but they're going to say the same thing about my stuff. Well, they've already started saying it about mine. But you know, in another generation, say, boy, this stuff is weird. You know, where was he coming from?
Has to do with your perspective and what you
saw.
Yeah,
and your background, sure.
And when was E. Merton Coulter here?
He came here in 1920, and he retired, but then he stayed on campus until he died. He was up there in Phi Cap, and he never came down to LeConte, and he'd been chairman at LeConte of the history department, and he never tried to second guess the chairman. So if you wanted to see him, you went up to Phi Cap, but he was readily available, and he'd talk your ear off. He's an interesting guy.
So he was here after 1968. You got here in
Yeah.
68?
I did his memorial, sir.
When did he die? About 80? Maybe 70s?
He was in his 90s.
Somebody told me that if you ever went to a dinner party and with a big table and Dean Tate was at one end and Coulter at the other, you could forget saying anything. But they were interesting guys.
Smart.
Yeah,
Bright,
yeah.
smart.
And funny.
Postcards and matchbook covers and motel brochures.
Well, the whole front of the first floor of Phi Cap was full of his books. And it was a little vague how many of those books were his and how many were the university's, but they all went to the university when he died. He was one of the first persons. Chapel Hill and some other places got into manuscript collecting in Georgia before we did. And he was one of the first to go into Georgia communities and get correspondence and diaries and this sort of thing. Chapel Hill beat us to that. But on the other hand, they preserved it. It's all still there at Chapel Hill. He was an interesting character, but he reminded me of uncles in my family.
He was married to his job.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a biography of his father.
I never read that.
There were only 157 copies, I think. He made it for the family members or cousins or whatever, and they gave me a copy.
Oh, great.
It's one one of the best things he's ever done about going to church and the way.
Uh-huh. Well, to a modern student, all this will sound like it was written on Mars. You know, it's another age. He was a Southern gentleman. You know, and people snicker at that, but he was a Southern gentleman. So was Dean Tate. It's a kind of
bygone era, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
It's a bygone day.
And kind of sad in a way. He was from Western North Carolina, I think. My father was from Kinston in Eastern North Carolina. And like Georgia and Virginia, Carolina's a big state.
Yeah.
With
Oh, yeah.
All right. Dr. Boney, we thank you so much for being with us today and helping us to expand upon and clarify some events and issues at the University of Georgia.
Well, you know, I'm an outsider. I never had any connection with the university or the state until I took a job here, but in some ways that's an advantage. I didn't bring any particular prejudices or viewpoints. Maybe I developed them, but if you go to a school like this, you do get some perspective that I can't match, but you also get a certain distortion. And Tom Dye is the same way. He didn't have any connection with Georgia before he before he came here to work. I think the main thing to remember is these schools are tremendously alike. We talk about the rivalries in academics and especially in sports, but they're so similar, it's almost laughable. The traditions, the fine points of the traditions are different, and the buildings are a little different. But what they're doing is very similar. Lord, they use the same textbooks. The profs come from all over the world.
Are we getting good education? Are we educating our children the way we should be?
I think so. I mean, I sometimes driving around town in the morning, I listen to Neil Bortz talk about government schools, and I agree that, you know, they've got some problems, but, you know, it ain't an easy job to educate people, especially public schools. But yeah, I think they do a good job overall. The schools have become heavily bureaucratized. There's so many bureaucracies and so many non-teaching people, but that's the way it is everywhere, and our whole society is that way. The public schools are that way too. But yeah, I think they do a pretty good job, and frankly, don't quote me on this, but I was pretty well paid for what I contributed. When I retired, I got a good pension. I'm loyal to UGA as long as that pension check comes. But if
Maybe
there's
we better call it quits on that note.